New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to the New Norm. I attended a funeral last week for Craig Spoolhoff, who passed away at the young age of 57. Craig was a class act, an all-around amazing guy who taught me a lot about humility, graciousness, patience, and perseverance. Craig was an avid runner, and the Bible verse on the program for his memorial service was Hebrews 12, verse 3, which reads, "Let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." It's not a new metaphor for faith and life. In fact, as he approached the end of his earthly journey, the Apostle Paul famously wrote, "I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith." That's a great goal, isn't it? To get to the end of your days and say, I finished the race marked out for me, the race God called me to run. But to do so means having crystal clarity around what we're doing and where we're going, and to anticipate the challenges along the way. When I was in grad school, one of my professors, a guy by the name of Bobby Clinton, did a lesson called Finishing Strong. And he had us do a quick overview of the history books in the Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. These record the lives and legacies of the kings of Israel and Judah over the 400-year span that they existed. Now, collectively, the track record of those kings, of their faithfulness to God and of their leadership to their people, is less than stellar. And my professor identified 6 derailers that threatened to throw leaders off track. And when I was growing up in the church, I was certainly familiar with 2, sex and money. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I only ever heard of leaders in business, faith, or government getting disqualified over one of 2 kinds of scandals, either a sexual one or a financial one. They lacked integrity in their private lives, in their marriages, or they got caught stealing money from the church or the government or their business. These are real challenges. On money, Jesus said, be careful about how you define treasure. There's a line in the Old Testament, in the book of Proverbs, that says, God, give me neither poverty nor riches, because if I have too much money, I'll forget you. If I have not enough, I might be tempted to steal. So how we think about money, how we think about resources, how we think about our access and utilization of financial resources does matter. It's a reflection of our hearts. It's an extension of our character. And on sexual ethics, Jesus says, be vigilant about your thought life. In fact, Paul says sexual misconduct doesn't just offend God, it actually harms us. In his letter to the Corinthians, he says, run away from sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside his body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. So that said, what guardrails have you put up in your life to maintain, protect, and defend your financial and sexual integrity? If you haven't thought about that yet, today is a good day to start. But those 2 are only part of the 6. In fact, here are the other 4: pride, power, plateau, and family. Let's talk about pride here for a second. Pride, at its essence, says, I'm better than you. I matter more. My choices, my agenda, my desires are elevated above everybody's around me. And if I have to step on you to get what I want, that's okay. We read an interesting passage in 2 Samuel chapter 24. It says this, that King David decided to take a census to have all of the fighting men of his nation counted. And Joab, the commander of the army, reported that the number of fighting men in Israel was 800,000, and in Judah it was 500,000. And then it says this in verse 10, that David was conscience-stricken after he had counted the fighting men. And he said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly in what I have done. Now, Lord, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. And some scholars think that to take a census was a declaration of David's pride. It was his confidence in his military authority and his reach that having that standing army gave him. Now, if you know anything about the story of David, you know that his most famous sin would have been his assault on Bathsheba and the resulting murder of her husband Uriah. But his most dangerous sin would have been taking the census. If you read to the end of the story, 70,000 people died as a result of his action. So in the short term, pride is just me getting what I want. In the long term, pride creates a wake of carnage of other people or relationships, roles that have been damaged or shredded when I ran over them to get what I thought I was entitled to. So pride is number 3 after sex and money. Number 4 is power. That's leveraging influence for personal comfort and gain rather than service to Christ and his people. And we're seeing more and more conversations about power these days. We're hearing stories about leaders who are getting disqualified because of how they handle their power. Leaders who are getting into trouble because it came out that they bullied, manipulated, intimidated, or demeaned the people around them. I worked for a pastor once whose primary leadership style was to control through fear and shame. And when he was confronted about this, he just doubled down and called his accusers divisive. And unfortunately, the elders and the executive team closed ranks behind him and created a situation that was no longer tenable for me, and I had to leave. Now, especially with the advent of social media, people are waking up to the abuse of power in families, churches, and organizations. So if God has given you influence in your family or in your church or in your business or in government or in the armed forces, how are you using that power? Are you leveraging that power for God's glory and the good of others? Or do you find yourself tempted to leverage it for you and you alone? The 5th of these 6 categories is plateau. It's kind of a coasting in my commitment to develop my faith, my relationships, my leadership, or my character. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, we read this: "In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem." Now, before I referenced a scenario with David and Bathsheba. If David had been where he was supposed to be, leading his men in combat against the Ammonites, he wouldn't have been in a position to see what he shouldn't have seen and to do what he ought not have done. And I think there are all seasons in our lives, especially as we get older, where we say, you know what, I've worked really, really hard. I've accumulated a lot of things. I just want to sit for a season. I just want to kind of chill out and celebrate all of the things that I've accomplished and make sure that I defend them. We kind of turn into like this really lazy dragon that's sitting on top of a hoard of treasure that he has accumulated over the course of a lifetime. And I think there's some of us who say, like, look, I spent a whole lifetime learning. I spent a whole lifetime challenging. I've already been to school. I've gotten coaching. I've got my certifications. I've got my degrees. Right now, I want to coast. I want to chill. I want to enjoy. And as a result, we don't take full advantage of stewarding this unique opportunity and season of our lives and saying, God, what else is it that you want me to learn? What new risk are you inviting me to undertake? Where do you want to stretch my faith or my leadership or my love? Because as long as we're breathing, we're not done living and God's not done stretching us. So beware the temptation to plateau. And then finally, the 6th one is family. My guess is that all of us know a leader who hit a ceiling because they weren't able to navigate some very real challenges in their parenting or their marriage. They had issues at home that went unchecked. We've got 2 examples of these in the book of 1 Samuel. The first one we read of in 1 Samuel chapter 2 that talks about Eli, who was the priest of Israel at the time. It says, now Eli was very old, and he heard everything his sons did to all Israel. In short, they were stealing from the sacrificial offerings that the people were making for their own personal gain, and how they lay with the women who assembled at the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who will intercede for him? Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father because the Lord desired to kill them. Now, at first reading, we could say, Steve, I don't understand what the problem is. Like, it seems that when Eli became aware of his son's misconduct, he leaned into it and addressed it. Well, here's the problem. The very first phrase of that passage says what? It says, now Eli was very old. So if Eli's in his 80s and his sons are in their 50s or 60s, they didn't just kind of like magically flip a switch and become shady people. My guess is that their character had been veering from what was right, true, and appropriate for years, if not decades. And that when Eli finally intervenes on his son's misconduct that is undermining the glory of God and his family's ministry credibility, it's too late. And unfortunately, that was a pattern that was repeated in Samuel's life. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, we read this. Now it came to pass when Samuel was old that he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, but his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered around and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, look, you're old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. If you read the rest of the story, you'll hear Samuel say, God wants to be your king. If you would trust him first and him only, you wouldn't need a human representative. In fact, their argument is, make us a king so that we can be what? Like the chosen, unique people of God? No, make us a king so that we can be like the other nations. And yeah, I don't know this for certain, but sometimes I wonder if Samuel had been in a different place as a dad, would his sons have been worthy, ready, and able to inherit his leadership and spare Israel the heartache of kings that would do them wrong? So here's the challenge that I have for you. Take these 6 words and put them on a Post-it note. Sex, finances, pride, power, plateau, and family. Take that note and put it in your Bible. Or if you're somebody who journals, put that on the inside cover of your journal and revisit that list once a month, once a quarter, at least once a year. And ask God, yourself, and a trusted confidant, how am I doing in these areas? Which one is most likely to sabotage my effort to finish my leadership run or my lifetime run well? And if God gives you insight, make sure you do what he says. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, families, and businesses stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.